very long time ago, when the world was young and changeable, and the forms of things were not yet fixed. Back in those days, the star spirits could take different forms and go visiting each other. This story begins in a constellation of stars. That's a particular pattern. A constellation of stars is a particular pattern of stars in the sky. And this constellation of stars, the Western world calls Cygnus, which means swan. Now one day, a star spirit in this constellation was having trouble entertaining her two children. The children were not very young. They were not as young as most of you. In fact, they were young teenagers, and they were definitely old enough to go and amuse themselves, which most days they did. But today, they were leaning on their mother like a couple of toddlers, complaining, "We're bored," and pestering her to do something with them. Their father, her husband, who when they were young had stayed home to help look after the children, he was now back at work. He was busy looking after the vast gardens and fields of the stars called nebulae. And he was going to be away for quite a while. So the mother decided to take the kids for a trip, a little visit, to a place she'd seen in the distance, which looked really pretty. This place she had her eye on was a little green and blue planet that we call Earth. And so they looked and they looked and they looked, and their necks grew long from looking far into the distance. And then they reached out and their arms grew long and into wings so they could fly to this place. And so they took the shape of swans to visit this planet called Earth. And they were red swans because there are many red stars in this constellation. And that's how they got their colouring. They landed. They flew and flew and flew, and then they landed softly and safely on the ocean. But the planet, which looked so peaceful from a distance, could be turbulent up close. And not long after they landed, a great wind picked up. It got stronger and stronger and spiraled, becoming a hurricane or a tropical cyclone. And it spun those big birds around and it threw them out in different directions. Each one was now alone and looking for the others. The boy child swan, he had been thrown far north without knowing it. As he searched for his sister and his mother, he travelled far across beautiful lands. Hills, valleys, mountains, rivers and lakes. The landscape always changing. Whenever he was tired or hungry, he landed on water and fed on the weeds and water plants. He met many creatures and he learned to speak with them. The further north he travelled, the colder it got, until he found lands which were completely covered in ice and snow. He could not go any further. He could not survive here, and he was sure the others would not be here either. But as he turned to go back to the lands he had come through, it seemed the ice and snow were chasing him. It all blew behind him and before him and around him, and now many of the lands that he had passed through were also covered in snow. He did not yet know winter had arrived. By the time he found warmer lands and waters, he had spent too long flying high above the white, white snow. The winter sun shone and reflected off the snow, and it was really bright, and it bleached his feathers to pure white. Even his red beak had paled into orange. In the meantime, his sister, the hurricane, had thrown her south. She also had great adventures through wonderful lands which also changed ever-changing from rainforests to deserts, to mountains and lakes. And like her brother, she too loved the water, and she followed the waterways. She too met many interesting and very colourful creatures. But as she was travelling across open wooded country during a dry, hot summer, big dark clouds piled up on the horizon, and another big wind rose. While she was taking shelter from the wind and the rumbling thunder, she saw a sudden massive flash of light, as if someone switched daylight on for a second, and it was followed by an earth-shattering crack of thunder and a splintering sound, and a tree burst into flame. It had been hit by lightning. The wind fanned the flames until the bush caught alight, and it pushed the fire forward. The swan found herself trying to outrace a bushfire, quickly realizing that was impossible. The only way to avoid it was to find its edge and get out of its way, which she did, curving her flight around the fire even as it spread sideways. She succeeded, and flying behind the fire, headlong into the wind, she ran away from the intense heat. But finally, she had to land, exhausted from the extreme efforts she'd gone to, and she landed in a burnt and blackened but cool landscape. Charcoal and soot covered her while she rested, turning her feathers black. When she could, she travelled on, eventually finding clean waters to wash in. But only the very tips of her feathers came clean. The rest of her stayed coal black, and the heat had made her beak even redder than before. Now, as the northern swan tried to find warmer weather, flying south, and the southern swan tried to find more peaceful waters, flying north, the mother swan, whose full story is not told here, she was trying to stay in the same place so her children could find her again.